I think mentoring is a huge, huge thing. I would very much, I would make sure that you try to reach out and find somebody that you would think would be an appropriate mentor who has kind of walked down the path that you'd like to walk down, and work on use their life experiences to help you move forward.
Wish you could just fast forward your life to the future, just to see what's going on? Us too. And while we couldn't break the time-space continuum, we can bring you the next best thing. You're listening to When I Grow Up, a podcast that matches Hopkins students with the people they dream of being in the future. Tune in to access intimate conversations with CEOs, entrepreneurs, artists, and hear answers to the questions we all wrestle with. Here's our student host for today's episode.
Hi, I'm Fatima Mendoza. I am from Tualatin, Oregon. I am a rising senior at Johns Hopkins. I am a political science major, and today I'm speaking with Mr. Jay Rand.
Hi, I'm Jay Rand. I am a partner in the law firm of Frankfurt, Kernet, Klein, and Sells. I'm in the corporate group. I work with entrepreneurs, funds and other investors, and early stage, generally technology-based companies. I am presently sitting in Westport, Connecticut. My job is generally working in the New York office.
So I guess we should start from the most obvious question. What is your job? What do you do?
Okay. So I am a partner in the corporate group at my firm. My job is advising clients on what we like to think of as, when it depends on the client to some extent. When I'm representing entrepreneurs and companies, it's generally anything that kind of falls within the typical life cycle of an emerging growth company, which means we start advising with respect to how to organize the company, what kind of entity to choose, strategies and appropriate approaches for how to allocate equity among founders. We advise on financing, both equity financing and other types of financing. And then ultimately, we work with the company all the way until hopefully a successful exit, usually in the form of a trade sale. I also work with funds in both helping them organize and structure how they are assembled, how they raise capital and then deploy it. And that is sort of on a macro basis and a micro basis, meaning that we'll help them assemble investors in the fund itself, and then we'll also help them work on specific investments that they make in various companies. Those are the two primary things that I get involved with. We also provide strategic advice, legal advice, truly, and strategic on a variety of business matters. It could be licensing, it could be employment, it could be joint venture development deals. There's a whole variety of business transactions that our clients engage in that we help out with. So our firm has, there's a very heavy degree of concentration in media, entertainment, arts, advertising, and particularly advertising technology. So many of the clients that I'm working with, many of the matters that I'm working on, fall into one or more of those industries. So, which is part of what I enjoy most about the work that I do, is the people I work with and the industries in which I tend to be engaged.
How did you end up in this position? Did you always have a desire to go into the legal field, or even the finance section or entrepreneurship and that type of sphere?
I'm still not sure in a lot of ways. So I guess I can kind of walk you through a little bit of my path. So as I mentioned earlier, I graduated Hopkins in '83. When I left, when I was graduating, I think college back then is somewhat different than college is today. Back then, it was much more common to go right out of college and right into graduate school. Business school, not so much, but other types of graduate schools, including law school, medical school. The sort of straight and narrow path was to go right from undergraduate into graduate school. I decided to take a year in between to make sure it was what I wanted to do. When I was graduating, I didn't have a very focused idea about exactly what it was that I wanted to do. I knew I was not pre-med. I figured that out early in my Hopkins career. And I gravitated towards political science. I actually had taken a fair number of economics classes, particularly in the first 2 years. I found myself more comfortable and more in tune with the work in political science, with the studies in political science. I figured I kind of maxed out on the quantitative aspects of economics after my sophomore year, as far as how far I wanted to take it. And I guess when you're focusing in those areas, law seemed to be kind of a natural segue, or the natural next step. And back then, there was a notion that if you ultimately saw yourself going into business, it didn't matter if you went to law school or business school. They were both considered paths, sort of viable paths to the same end goal. So I would say that at the time my Hopkins career was ending, I sort of had this vague notion that I wanted to be in business in some manner, but I couldn't really tell you in what capacity, for what kind of venture or anything like that. So as between law school and business school, I actually considered both alternatives. And I took the LSATs first, and then later on decided, to consider perhaps getting a JD MBA degree. And I did take the GMATs, and my thought at the time was, first I'll decide what law school I was going to, and most of the law schools that I was applying to had viable and very good business schools, and I figured I would apply to the business school once I got into the law school, because it was kind of came to that decision kind of late in my, in my academic career. So, and that was my thought process there. I got accepted to Penn. I skipped over that for the year between my graduation from Hopkins and going to law school. So most of that year I spent as a legal assistant in a small litigation firm. At that point, I kind of knew I didn't want to be a litigator. And that's kind of the first sort of decision tree that you reach as to whether do you want to be a litigator or not be a litigator. Being a litigator is itself, I'd say a personality type as well as a work type that I didn't think was really me. It seemed that some form of transactional work was really what I was aiming for. And at that point, I wasn't sure if it would be corporate or it would be real estate or be some other type of transactional practice, but I figured it was a non-litigation path. So anyway, fast forward, I went to University of Pennsylvania for law school. Was really happy at Penn. It was a really good collegial environment. I got a job my second summer, which is a fairly traditional path, working in a very large law firm in New York. It was a law firm that that had virtually every specialization under the sun. I ended up I had an offer to return there after graduation as a permanent associate. I ended up going to a different law firm. Again, something that was common back in the mid to late 80s. That's not so common anymore. Nowadays, when you get your summer associateship after your second year in law school, the chances are you're going to stay with that firm after graduation. Back then, that wasn't necessarily the case, although a significant number of people did that. So, I started in my career at a different large law firm, one that had a practice that was a little bit more interesting to me because it wasn't as much of a Fortune 500 practice as it was a kind of eclectic mix of clients in media, sports, entertainment, some technology. And at that point, I hadn't really articulated exactly what kind of lawyer, or even still what kind of business I wanted to be in. But it also coincided with a time I graduated law school in 1987, and probably no more than 2 weeks after I graduated, we had a market crash, the big market crash of '87, which significantly impacted the work in the corporate group, which is the group that I went into. And so the work was kind of slow. It was some deal work, but the securities work, which is public offerings and the like, that the firm had depended on, particularly the corporate group, and this is true not just in that firm, but in other firms as well, it really just dried up for a period of time as the market waited to see what kind of a correction it was going to be. In the meantime, many of us in the corporate group got redeployed to doing other things. In my case, I was put on a very large matter involving the transfer of a nuclear regulatory license for a client. And I was not I had no aspirations of being in that business. It wasn't clear how long I would be doing that or what I would ultimately be doing once that particular type of work no longer kept me busy. And I was getting involved a little bit. I got involved a little bit with some cable TV work at that firm, which I found interesting. But I kind of came to the conclusion that I wasn't getting a lot of deals, and I kind of started realizing that what I really wanted to get some experience with was deals and understanding how deals worked and understanding how negotiations worked, and really kind of getting my, getting more of an expertise in that area. So I ended up moving to a new firm about 2 years after, in the early to mid part of '89. I moved to a firm which was a very, very good New York mid-sized firm that specialized in private equity work. The good thing what I liked about private equity initially was that it was about, you were dealing with people. Dealing with a private equity fund, at least back in those days, was a lot different from dealing with a Fortune 500 company or some amorphous investment bank where, everything was layered up on both sides of the deal, where, your second year associate at one law firm only talked to a second year associate at another law firm. There was a little bit more kind of flexibility and a freewheeling nature about it, which I really liked. And I was sort of like okay with it. I was sort of in this mode for a couple of years of enjoying the work at some level, but finding it on other levels to be a bit tedious, because much of the way deal work is conducted is a lot of the real, what some people think was the interesting stuff, particularly from a business standpoint, happens early on as the terms are being fleshed out in the deal. Later on, you get more into execution, which is about paperwork and correcting typos and, some of the things that just what are people refer to as blocking and tackling. And that was of a little bit less interest to me. The other thing that I kind of found to be a little bit, I would say, not as attractive as I would have liked was that private equity quite often is about putting money into a company to create greater efficiencies in that company's business, which certainly had some interest to me. But I started realizing that value creation, and when I say value creation, I don't mean in terms of like company valuation, but I mean like, at the end of the day, when you think about what is it that I'm contributing to the success of a business, to the success of a transaction, to just, success overall or to development overall. And I really was not sure I couldn't really articulate what it was that I was sort of adding value to, for lack of a better phrase. About 1992, I got put on a deal involving a venture capital fund. And as niche as private equity was, venture capital was even more niche. The work that I was doing was working with funds that were putting investments in very early companies. And, the light went on. There was something that I found really intriguing about working in that area, in part because I found that the people who were in the funds, the principals in the funds, had a similar mindset to mine, which is they loved the idea of creating value. I mean, in their case, they were, also concerned about their returns, but on a very gut level, the idea of creating value was something that was important to them. And perhaps more importantly, I'm working with entrepreneurs. I'm working with people who really are starting businesses at the seat of their pants. Many of them had been working in large companies, were dissatisfied for one reason or another, and decided they wanted to strike it on their own. And I was really attracted to those kinds of people. And finally, after 4 or 5 years of practice, I kind of said, wow, this is it. This is really what I want to do. And that's ultimately the direction I headed in. I actually went to work at a software company for a year. I gained some really valuable experience in working with technology companies, just particularly in terms of understanding how they think. But I also, from that experience, learned that there are two things that you can be in a business. You can either be a profit center or a cost center. And you are treated much better if you're a profit center than you would be as if you were a cost center. And I found that lawyers often get treated as being a cost center and not a profit center when they're not in the law firm environment. When you are in a law firm environment, it's a little bit different. So I came back to private practice, and my return to private practice coincided with the development of the internet, and it coincided with internet becoming this really, really hot area that everybody wanted to invest in. And my timing was good because I had this expertise of understanding how venture capital worked at a time when there were not that many people who were practicing in it. I mean, really, the rest, I would say almost the rest is history. From that point forward, I became, the guy who worked with startups, both on the primarily initially on the fund side, and then over the course of my career, it's become more of a mix between working with funds and working with companies. But largely in the same ecosystem. And that same ecosystem has evolved over the years. And so I have sort of shifted industry focus over the years. I would say the last several years, it's been much more media and entertainment focused. But my work has largely been the same. I'm still working with entrepreneurs. I'm still working with investors. I'm still working with early stage companies. And I'm still seeing the value in what my input into a transaction or into a client is. And that's what keeps me going.
You mentioned that you kind of knew that litigation side wasn't for you, that it takes a certain type of personality. Would you mind explaining that decision of yours, or why litigation isn't for you and why transactional works for you?
I found that, and I'd say I probably had an idea of that going into law school. But one of the courses that you take in your first year in law school is a legal writing class. And legal writing has a lot of components to it. One of the components is writing briefs and actually doing arguments of the briefs. And I found it, mentally, I found it really interesting. I found it, you kind of put on the spot and you get asked questions and you really need to be prepared. And that part of it I actually found to be very invigorating and interesting and motivating. But at the end of the day, I didn't feel like, litigation is not an area where you're necessarily trying to find common ground with the other side. I just found myself naturally more the type that wanted to find common ground and find creative ways to get a deal done. Try to find the way to break an impasse. And maybe it's just at the core of it, it was not necessarily, it was back to the whole value creation thing. What is it that I'm actually doing here? What is it that I'm doing that contributes to a greater good? And I wasn't really finding that I was, that was the path for me to get there.
That's very interesting, because in my head, this is still relatively very new. So even me thinking about law school is a lot of what is this really?
I mean, I think one of the good things about law school is that it's very different things to different people. And if you're, people who go through the same, you might hear the exact same story that I just told you about my legal writing experience be told, and then the only difference is the ending, which is I loved it. I said, this is what I want to do the rest of my life. And there are probably a lot of lawyers who had that experience and then became litigators. I mean, I'm not sure I'm the one who can explain how somebody decides they want to be a tax lawyer. And then there are others who say, I want to be a Supreme Court clerk because I want to make real, important and changing policy decisions, or be involved in making, significant policy determinations and decisions. And law school will enable you to do that. After your first year, you get, there's a wide variety of electives that you can choose to take. So you can really, after, a year or so, make a decision about which way you're going to go. Now, the other thing, nowadays people wait a lot longer to go to graduate school than they did when I was in school. I waited a year. I think my year at Penn, if I remember correctly, certainly more than half the class came right out of undergraduate. Now that number is significantly lower. It's a minority, at least judging from the classes that I've had in Columbia. The percentage is significantly lower of people who come right out of school. And not only that, but it's not necessarily a one-year thing anymore. I mean, now people go and they work for 2, 3, 4 years and then decide to go back. And they come back in, I think, the longer you take between your undergraduate and whatever graduate program you decide to go back into, whether it's law, business, or anything, you're going to go back in most likely with a much better and a more spelled out and fleshed out sense of where you want to go. If I were going to school today or deciding to go to school today, I would probably have taken some more time in between and come in with a much more, fleshed out sense of what I ultimately thought I'd be doing.
That was actually one of my questions, because I did mention first generation. Half the time I don't know what I'm doing. And I used to think like finish college, law school, that's how that works, correct? And that's kind of the thing that scares me at the moment. I'm like, law school, especially right now, is such a huge investment in time, money, and everything. And in my head, I feel like it would be smart of me to work a couple of years something in the industry to see if that is actually what I want.
I think that look back, is it people have gotten smarter? I'm not sure. But back then, the presumption was that if you were going to take some time before you went to law school, working in a law firm would be the best route to allowing you to determine if that was the ultimate career path for you. I'm not so sure that's true anymore. I guess there are two things that I'd say. Number one is that back when I graduated college, or was in the sort of college law school period, and even for a number of years after that, people's career decisions were much more long-term than they are today. I think now people go in, and it seems that much more commonly it's a 2 or 3 year proposition. I'm not talking about people my age. I'm talking about people closer to your age, where, you go in, you go to a large firm, or you go to whatever job you're taking, and you're looking at it for a couple of years. And then, you decide, is it really a match for me? Is the company a match for me? Is the profession a match for me? Is the work environment a match for me? There's a much more 360-degree view, I think, that people in your generation take about how they fit within the workplace than people in my generation took. So I think that you have, I think the notion of not knowing what you're going to do the next 10 years of your life freaks you out, don't let it freak you out, because I think that's more the norm than the exception these days.
Well, thank you for that. I was wondering, what is the most impactful or your favorite project or deal that you've been a part of?
Wow. I have one in particular that comes to mind. And it was early on in the internet days. I was working with a team of 5 guys. And this will sound somewhat more romanticized. But I had this one company that was it was a web software company. And it was basically 5 guys who worked out of one person's apartment, and started really with just very little, they raised very little money. They never went to institutional venture capital funds to raise capital. They didn't have, sometimes with institutional venture capital, there's a sense of like, there's a hype element to it where the company gets to benefit from the hype of the press release that announced that the fund came in. And these guys didn't have the benefit of any of that. They were just going along, doing what they were doing. And then about a year and a half after we raised a small amount of money for them, they hit a window because they had an application that this is the days of portals, which predates you by a long shot. But there was a period of time when you had Yahoo and Alta Vista and AOL and all these companies that were portals, which were like when you logged onto the internet and you dial up, you went right to this page that was your interface with with the rest of the web. Now Google has pretty much supplanted all of that. But that's what you did. And there was a race for portals to develop functionality in all sorts of different areas so that, if you were a user, you'd go onto that portal and you would, run your life through that portal, and you'd have your email through them, and you'd have your, your calendar through them, and all of your various, elements of your online life would be conducted through that portal. And there was a period of time when they were all racing to gather all that functionality. And this company, this client of mine, fell into that. They hit the window, as we like to say, where they became a sought after company because what they did was attractive, both from the standpoint of functionality, because it worked really well. And they ended up getting sold to one of the big portals of the day in a transaction that involved getting the portal stock. And at a time when there was a huge amount of a run up in the market. So between the time that the deal closed and we were then locked up in the ability to sell the stock in the open market, in the several months between the time the deal closed and the stock moved into, was able to be sold, the stock tripled in value by 3 more times. So they were already going to do well enough as the deal price, based on the deal price when they closed, but then it got to go up another 3x. And the reason that this comes to mind is because it was the most grateful client I ever had. I remember we had a closing dinner and everybody was in tears. I mean, these were genuinely nice people who really kind of just did it the right way and had no pretension about, what they deserved in the market. They just did their work. They put their heads down. They didn't try to hype themselves into a transaction, and it worked out great for them. And I'm still in touch with almost all of them. One of whom is actually still an active client in another business. So, the thing that so what do I take out of that? The long-term relationships. I have a lot of them in the last built over the last 25 plus years. Some of the same people who I started working with back in the mid 90s, I'm still working with today. And I really cherish those relationships. And I'm glad that they're still motivated to do what they do and keep me motivated to do what I do.
Wow. Thank you. I really enjoyed that story. One of my closing, I guess, questions is, I've mentioned it throughout, I am first generation college student. My question for you is what advice or insight do you have for people like me? I'm first generation, limited income, woman, Latina, Mexican American. I'm sure, at least I hope, you've come across people even in your firm or students. If you have any advice or insight for navigating the legal profession at law school.
It's a great question. And many law firms, ours included, are, really making huge efforts in the with DEI and understanding institutional biases and things like that, and trying to make sure that we are hearing and we are able to communicate appropriately with candidates who, fit some of those criteria that you just mentioned. Some of them are things like, I didn't come from I'm not first generation college. So there are definitely things that I, just based on my own surroundings that I was familiar with that you might not be. I think, taking advantage of any resource that is available to you to help bridge that gap. I think mentoring is a huge, huge thing. I would very much, I would make sure that you try to reach out and find somebody that you would think would be an appropriate mentor who has kind of walked down the path that you'd like to walk down, and work on, use their life experiences to help you move forward. And I would tell you not to be intimidated by anything or anybody. There is more than a sort of a lip service degree of attention being paid throughout the entire legal industry about making sure that we are as inclusive as we can be. Frankly, our clients are demanding that. So I think, I think there's a lot of reason for encouragement for you. And I hope that there are people out there whose stories are, can resonate with you, and you reach out to them and try to, take advantage of their experiences to try to help make your path easier.
Thank you. Again, I would like to thank you for taking the time to sit down with me and discuss
I'm glad we had the chance to. I really enjoyed this. I'm happy to try to, assist in whatever way I can as you try to navigate your own path.
Thank you so much. My name is Fatima Mendoza, and on this week's episode, I interviewed Jay Rand. I want to talk to Jay because I am really interested in the convergence of entertainment and law. And so I Googled all the best entertainment firms in the country, and his jumped out at me. And so I decided to make contact with him. And although he is not an entertainment lawyer, I am still very interested in the work that he does, because he manages to merge business, tech, and law. And that is a subject that I'm deeply fascinated by as well. In this conversation, we also talk about Mr. Rand's career trajectory, as well as some projects he's been a part of, and the differences between litigation and transactional work. And I also learned the importance of value creation and having faith and confidence in your journey despite certain obstacles.
You have been listening to When I Grow Up, brought to you by Higher Hopkins and Hopkins Connect at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you to our When I Grow Up podcast team and all the people who make this podcast possible, including our editor, Thomas Nishimoto, our host students, and all of our guests.